Hello everybody, welcome to another video. So I didn't want to make a video about current events, but a lot has been going on in the world that involves China and the Chinese government. And a lot has been written about the idea that we're in a second Cold War with China, or at least the US and China are. Over the last few weeks, both the US and the Chinese government have accused each other of waging a Cold War, or at least having a Cold War mentality. And to be honest, I think we are in a second Cold War. I think it does meet that definition. But it's clearly been waging for quite some time now. I think you could date the origin of the second Cold War at least back to the trade war in 2018, or even the Huawei revelations in 2016. And to be honest, I don't think we really have a choice but to engage in a Cold War with China, because the alternative is to allow an authoritarian model of development to spread around the world, and for them to co-opt much of the developing world, and for the democratic countries to simply decline and fall into chaos, which appears to be China's plan. As I've talked about in other videos, I think it's fairly obvious that China is actively exporting its authoritarian model around the world, using things like economic pressure, political subversion, and its technological outreach. I assume that pretty much everybody's heard about the Hong Kong national security law and the Indian border standoff that's now occurring. And it's actions like this that make it all the more important that countries need to actually formulate a containment policy against the Chinese government. And I'm glad the US government now appears to be doing many of the things that I suggested in my last video, such as denying visas for students linked to Chinese military schools. But I think the real key player at the moment is Europe and the European Union, because most European leaders are actually very cowardly when it comes to China, and the European Union itself has basically said it's not going to do anything in response to Hong Kong's annexation. It's basically just going to be business as usual. The UK, I'm very happy that the UK has announced that it's going to allow citizenship for nearly 3 million Hong Kong citizens. I hope eventually this expands to more of them. And the UK government has backed off the Huawei deal, which is a very good development. I'd like to see them go a lot further and introduce sanctions. You do see individual countries like Sweden, France. Sweden's tried to move its companies out of China, has blocked the Confucius Institute. France has started arming Taiwan. So you can see individual European countries are pursuing their own policies to try and decouple with China. But because the European Union is so useless and effectively isn't doing anything, what you really need is an alternative structure between democratic countries to combat what's happening, to align them against China. And so the UK government has proposed this D10 strategy, which will involve 10 democratic countries, basically the G7 countries, and Australia, Korea, and India, which are supposed to be a strategy for countries to develop 5G as an alternative to Huawei. I think it's a very good development, and I think the D10 should become a platform for developing a national security strategy to contain the CCP. So what's happening now is that the Chinese government is initiating border conflicts on multiple fronts. So firstly you have Hong Kong, where the legal system is effectively going to be absorbed by the mainland, and it seems that Hong Kong is effectively going to be turned into South Shenzhen, because the government will have free rein to imprison anybody who it sees as a political dissident. And I'm fairly sure that internet censorship will soon follow this. I'm very pessimistic about this. I don't see much hope for Hong Kong, to be honest. It seems that the Chinese government has simply branded the Hong Kong population as a problem population, and I think we'll just see the same handbook played out there that we've seen in Xinjiang and Tibet. We've also seen the Indian border standoff unravelling over the last few weeks, which appears to be China's revenge for the Doklam standoff in 2017, where the Chinese government was attempting to build a road through Bhutan, which borders India, as part of a military strategy to allow them access into the country. The Indian military then entered Bhutan and basically told China to stop doing it, which they then agreed to because construction halted and the Chinese military withdrew. And so now, after India has changed the status of Kashmir and the Jammu region, That seems to have given China an excuse to move its troops back to the border and threaten India because it's currently building roads to give it access to Nepal and other regions. I do think this is simply an excuse by the Chinese government to rally nationalist support and to deflect domestic criticism internally. I do think that Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, is a lot more intelligent than Xi Jinping as an operator, and I think you've seen that because he's been able to effectively outsmart Xi Jinping in both of these standoffs, so I hope India doesn't back down. You also have the leaked plans that the Chinese government was planning to rehearse the invasion of a Taiwanese island in August as part of an intimidation strategy against the Taiwanese government, to stop the president there, Tsai Ing-wen, from talking about independence or from seeking alliances with other democratic countries. And they seem to have been pursuing very aggressive sea patrols against Malaysia and Indonesia as part of the same strategy. The South China Sea is still an area where a conflict is most likely to break out. I think China would probably quite like to have a little military skirmish there just to distract attention. And this makes it all the more important that there is actually a military alliance there to contain this. Basically as a shield against this kind of action. But aside from these more immediate military threats, you have a number of other strategic threats that China is currently presenting. The most pressing one being China's attempt to set up its own internet structure controlled by its government, which will likely lay the ground for the Great Firewall expanding outside of China's borders. In 2019, Huawei and the Chinese government unveiled their plan to create an alternative internet infrastructure which would give sovereign states a lot more regulation over the internet than they currently have. Huawei's 5G plan was also part of this, and it would basically give a way for the Chinese government to steal and censor information once they have control of the internet in these regions. As I mentioned in a previous video, China is currently attempting to introduce its social credit system into Kazakhstan by next year, but Kazakhstan has also recently developed its own version of China's Great Firewall. It's just on a much smaller scale, but this basically gives them the same infrastructure that China has when it comes to censoring its internet. Also, Thailand, of all countries, has tried to introduce its own version of the Great Firewall a few years ago, but then they shelved it after public backlash. And in general, censorship in Southeast and Central Asia has been increasing massively over the last few years. These current plans are nowhere near as extensive as China's Great Firewall, as these would greatly harm business interests in these countries, but they could lay the groundwork for further censorship. China also recently launched a number of satellites into space that would provide a kind of global internet as part of something called the Xingyun project, which is meant to be a counter to Elon Musk's SpaceX internet satellite project called Starlink, which launched earlier this year. During China's project, they had 2 rockets that failed to launch, and one of the rockets actually exploded before entering orbit, and wreckage fell down onto Ivory Coast and Guam, and only missed New York by a few minutes. This comes after China's launch of a quantum satellite called Mischius in 2016, which is the first quantum satellite ever created, which is an attempt to provide unhackable communication. Arguably the most worrying dimension of China's current plans is an attempt to centralize its giant digital payments infrastructure. As anyone who's lived in China will know, most people in China pay for things using online payment systems like Alipay and WeChat instead of using cash or credit cards. And this is so common that you can see beggars on the street with printed barcodes hanging around their necks. In 2018, the Chinese government forced Alibaba CEO Jack Ma to step down and effectively took over the company and built thousands of data centers all over the country to monitor these financial payment systems. Alibaba, the Chinese company, just recently has taken over Cambodia's digital payment system, and China has just announced the creation of its own digital currency, a kind of bit yuan, which appears to be part of a strategy to centralize and gain control over a financial payment infrastructure. Now, some people argue that because of China's sporadic and non-transparent currency controls, that most companies will be very unwilling to adopt Chinese standards of financial technology. But too many businesses in Southeast Asia and Central Asia that are very reliant on trade with China, they might have no choice but to do so. And so I think the European Union and the US and democracies in general need to develop a system to counteract this. And all of these different dimensions currently are the kind of battlegrounds for Cold War II. And the reason I think it does meet that definition is because if you look at most of China's sphere of influence, they mostly involve the former communist states, or states that were allied with the Soviet Union in the First Cold War. Something that makes this Cold War different is that it's primarily not a military conflict. China is currently happy to let Russia and Iran project their military power for it, although this might change in the near future. You don't have the two great powers constantly threatening each other with nuclear war. The other thing that makes this Cold War different is that because it's primarily based on economic power and technology, the lines are much more blurred over which countries support which powers. There's not really a clear demarcation about which countries are aligned with China and which countries are allied with the US, for example. But I think if you look at the countries that condemned the Xinjiang policy, as opposed to countries who supported the Xinjiang policy, that appears to be quite a clear demarcation between two political camps. On the positive side, China's economy seems to be in pretty dire straits and seems to be much worse than they're reporting. The current measures taken by the CCP in response to the crisis is actually less than what they did in 2015. They chose to cut taxes and regulation rather than go for a stimulus package. And the reason they cited is that their property bubble appears to have now actually burst. Property prices fell over 40% during the crisis in 1 month. And because this made up more than 25% of China's GDP, this means that China basically has no money left for its investment policies. The US so far has actually been pursuing a very good policy, for example, limiting China's technology capacity by stopping Taiwanese companies supplying Huawei with silicon chips, for example, because China still doesn't have the ability to make these chips itself. But unfortunately, China appears to be locked into this mentality where the worse things get for it, the more challenges it faces, the more it has to accelerate this aggressive approach and get all these policies done now. The world might find itself locked into a kind of accelerationist confrontational approach where these sanctions just kind of escalate and resulting in some kind of military conflict. But ultimately, all of this stuff at the moment is very short term, and the main thing I think the world needs to do is create sort of long-term containment strategy, which will extend far past the current governments that are occupying Western countries. And so I hope the alliances that are currently forming will become a lot more entrenched over time. So, thank you for listening.